Hi, everyone. Welcome to the webinar. Let's give 1 or 2 minutes for people to join. My name is Julia Rivero, and together with the Sustainable Economic team, we are going to be presenting this dialogue. So, welcome, everyone. We can see people are joining at the moment. Great. So yes, again, welcome everyone. My name is Julia Rivero, and we are here to discuss the impact of prices, the impact of EU trade agreements on prices. If you can write us in your chat, where are you, what the weather is at the moment, where are you located, that will help us to get to know each other a little bit. You can write on the chat. We have people in Belgium, Groningen, Netherlands. I'm sorry if the weather is gray for some of you. Hi, Anna from Ecuador, Germany. Great. Many different places. So before we start, I would like to explain what are we going to discuss today. The aim of this online dialogue among civil society and producer representatives in the fair trade movement is to include the perspective of the Global South in the debate about EU trade agreements with partner countries. Just so you know, the learnings and needs coming out of these webinars will be condensed in a demand paper, and that will be shared and discussed with members of the European Parliament in May. So that is why these dialogues are so relevant, and we hope that we can see your questions in the chat box so that we can address the key topics about EU trade agreements and prices. As Young Fair Trade advocates, we believe that there is no future without climate, social, and trade justice. So stick together to learn how this can be achieved from the voices of true activists and representatives of the fair trade movement. People keep joining. Welcome, everyone. I would like to also thank our patron and MIP, Monica Bana, for being our patron, for supporting this dialogue. Of course, FTO for making this possible, for creating this space for dialogue, and also for inviting MIPs from other EU party sections to this initiative. We know that they are interested in the dialogues and that they want to know about the outcomes and use what we do here today to make good political decisions. I would also like to thank the sponsors of this initiative, Swiss Fair Trade, Manager Europe, IAC Berlin, Fair Activists from Fair Trade Germany, Crosspoint, La Paz, Novi Syndicat, FTO, of course. So without further ado, I'm going to introduce the speakers to this session. More people keep joining, so welcome everyone. First, we have with us Marike de Pena. Marike de Pena is a sociologist in agricultural developments, and since 2000, she is the director of Banderino Cooperative, a successful fair trade banana smallholder organization in the Dominican Republic. Marike has dedicated her life to building and strengthening the voice and participation of farmers and workers through their organizations and network. Then we have Brenda Akankunda. She is a lawyer, trade, investment policy analyst with 5 years of experience in research and advocacy. She is currently the program officer of investment for sustainable development at Seatini, where she works towards influencing trade and investment policy reforms to support the growth of small indigenous entrepreneurs and the protection of human rights. And finally, we have Muhammad Azizul Islam. He is a professor in sustainability and accounting and transparency at the University of Aberdeen Business School, and he has over 17 years of experience. He has been investigating the use of social audits and corporate social responsibility disclosures, corporate transparency on modern slavery, and the SDGs. He might join 10 minutes late because of personal reasons, but in this house, we support conciliation between work and life, so we will welcome him when he joins. I would also finally like to thank the rest of the economic sustainability team at the Young Fair Trade Advocates. Again, my name is Julia Rivero. I used to work for the World Fair Trade Organization, and together with Francesca, Prandi, and Victoria Paparinga, we will be moderating the dialogue. Our colleague Alexandra Vasquez Mera, she's very diligently moderating the chat if you have any questions or need support, so do not hesitate to write, she's there. And thank you to the interpreters too, who will be providing live Spanish interpretation if you need it. So we have a very broad audience. We have students, we have actors from civil society, from the Global South, we have advocates. Welcome everyone. Before we start, I would just want to remind that the next webinar is going to focus on gender. Our colleagues are going to be moderating a webinar about the unheard voices, and it will happen on the 7th of March at 3 p.m. FTAO will share the registration link on their social media very soon. So now, just to get started, I would love to read if you could suggest a book, a song, or a movie that includes the word fair. So you can just write it on the chat. A song, a movie, a book, something that you want to recommend and that includes the word fair. We will be reading your answers. And also, just so you know, you have two different chat boxes. One is a general chat where you can respond to these questions, you can make comments, and then you have the Q&A chat box. So don't forget to leave your questions on the Q&A chat box so that you can we can read it at the end of the session and address your questions. You can address your question to a specific speaker. You can address them in general, and then all of them will be able to provide you with their insights. Now, as everybody shares their answers, we are going to play a very short video from our patron, Monica Vana, who is going to introduce the dialogue and explain why this is so important for MIPs to hear about the voices, hear by the voices of the Global South, what the impact of EU trade agreements is on prices.
Much, Matthias Haberl, for the invitation to this very interesting initiative and the honor to open the online dialogue about the economic sustainability of EU trade agreements. First, I want to congratulate all of you, because you are right. There is no future without climate, social and trade justice. We need more young adults that stand up for their principles and advocate for them. It is important that you get involved and try to support the political movement that you want. You are the present and the future, and you can be very proud of what you already achieved. As the Greens EFA group in the European Parliament, we envision an EU that uses its powers as a massive trading bloc to promote the green transition and human rights all over the world. EU trade agreements have a strong impact on social, economic and environmental development here in Europe, and often even more so in the partner countries. We want the EU to only agree to deals that are good for people and the planet, rather than deals that are only about profits for some and plundering of natural resources. Trade policy has to be fully compatible with climate objectives. Moreover, trade should be an instrument serving EU climate policy. We need a paradigm shift in trade policy, whereby the social, environmental and gender dimension is truly at the core of trade and investment deals. All trade agreements should therefore be conditional on sustainability provisions, as well as conditional to strong social and workers' rights and gender equality. We want to make sure every EU trade deal is in line with the European Green Deal and our commitments to the Paris Agreement, as well as the ILO Convention. It is crucial that you are loud, raise your voices and make yourself heard. We need to listen to you, because in every deal there are different parties concerned, and the voices from the global south and people on the ground experience the real impact of unfair trade deals. And we must never forget that trade agreements affect different genders differently due to the deep structural gender inequalities. That is unacceptable. There is an urgent need to move towards a trade policy that promotes the change of traditional gender roles instead of reinforcing them, and promotes strong and social rights, including minimum income. While you see this video, I am in New Zealand with a cross-party European Parliament's delegation to speak about the recently finalized free trade agreement with New Zealand. Although we as Greens EFA Group prefer multilateral trade agreements above bilateral ones, we have to admit that the New Zealand Free Trade Agreement is the best by now that we have on the table. You know that the European Parliament has to give its final consent to each trade agreement, but we are fighting for being much better involved in the negotiations during the whole process of trade agreements. I wish you a very insightful event, and I'm looking forward to the results of it. I will look for it on social media. I hope to see you in the European Parliament in spring for your final event. Dear youth.
Great, that was inspiring. I can see very cool titles on the chat. Fair Play Movie, Fair Traders, the book from Thomas Piketty. I'm also a fan of him. Capital in the 20. Sorry, I cannot read very well. Journal, Fair Trade Journal. Wow, yeah, I didn't know all these. Yeah, you should go check them out. And you can still add your titles in the chat during the rest of the session. So now I will pass the word to my colleague Francesca Prandi. She is going to be moderating the dialogue and leading for the next part of the session. So thank you, Francesca.
Thank you, Julia, for your introduction, and thanks to our speakers to have joined us today. We really hope that you will enjoy our dialogue and find it a way to know better the work of fair trade and also the impact that EU trade agreements especially have on prices and on producers. We'll now dive into the core of our meeting. And for this reason, I'm asking directly to our three speakers today an initial, very broad question, which will give you also the opportunity to present your work. And the question is, what is your mission as an activist, or for example, in the case of Brenda, as a lawyer or as a professor? So maybe we can start with Marike.
Sure, you can. Thank you, and thank you for giving me this opportunity. I'm Marike de Pena. I'm the managing director of a banana cooperative, smallholder banana cooperative in the Dominican Republic. And also currently the chair of CLAC, which is the Latin American and Caribbean network of fair trade farmers and workers. And we represent over 1,000 organizations in Latin America and the Caribbean. What is my mission? My mission from the very, very, very beginning, more than 35 years ago, has been working and organizing smallholder farmers. As a way to enable farmers to participate in trade and meet market expectations, as well as having a stronger voice in negotiation by negotiating better prices or trading conditions. We have not only organized farmers in cooperatives. In Latin America, we have also, well, we were one of the motor behind fair trade. Our farmers in Mexico many years ago already decided that trade needed to change. So trade could be a motor for change, but also, well, we need to do things different, because on the one side, trade can be a perfect tool. On the other side, trade can be very destructive if it's not done the right manner. So we have been organizing in Latin America farmers in cooperatives, cooperatives in networks, and networks in regional networks, so we can influence better trade. We have a stronger voice as farmers and workers, and we can be in this kind of spaces where we can talk about unfair trading practices, as well as giving our vision about what needs to change. So this is what we do. It's about empowerment, it's about supporting, and it's about having a stronger voice.
Thank you so much, Marike. I will now give the floor to Muhammad.
Hi, can you hear me? Yeah, all right. Thank you. My name is Muhammad Azizul Islam. I'm the professor in accountancy, sustainability accounting, mainly, based in University of Aberdeen Business School. My research area mainly corporate accountability in relation to workers' working conditions. My motivation to do research, actually, when I grew up in Dhaka, capital city of Bangladesh, the area was surrounded by garment factories supplying fashion retailers. And I used to see hundreds of workers entering and leaving every day. And when I did my undergraduate in accounting at Dhaka University in Bangladesh during 90s, I found my education in profit maximization contradicted my daily exposure to workers' livelihoods, which led me to realize that accounting avoids, particularly financial accounting, avoids engaging with underprivileged workers, despite the importance of profit for company. I realized the flaws in not only our accounting systems, but entire business school curriculums when it came to human rights and corporate social responsibility. This scenario inspired me to pursue research that could challenge these mainstream education practices and mainstream business practices. And when I started my PhD back in 2005, I chose a topic that focused on garment workers in Bangladesh. Obviously, my PhD supervisors and my guide motivated me to do this work. And I have been doing research in this area for 17 years. So recently, we have finished research on unfair practices by fashion retailers. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And I will now give the floor to Brenda.
Okay, thank you very much for having me here today. And it's always a privilege to speak to especially when I hear of an audience that consists of young people like myself. So yes, I am a lawyer. However, I want to speak as a policy analyst with Siatini Uganda, which is the institution that I work for. So Siatini stands for Southern and Eastern Africa Trade Information and Negotiations Institute. And this was formed in the 1996 after the World Trade Organization meeting, ministerial conference. And the main idea was the realization that African countries and the global North, the global South in general, is left out during negotiations. They don't have a negotiating space. So Siatini was formed to support negotiators within the global South for them to be able to advance their interests within the global spaces like the WTO. So that is the basis of Siatini, and definitely our mission is to ensure that the policies that we have in place promote pro-development, trade, fiscal, and investment related aspects. And we advance this at the national, regional, and global level. So that is basically the mission and what we stand for. And we've also, as we narrow down the work that we do, we have realized that as Africa, we suffer a challenge of trade injustice. And we highly believe that this is because trade is determined by the policies. But what we see is that the policies today are being determined by the big corporations. So we see that Africa has no space on the negotiating table. And definitely we end up seeing certain rules working in favor of those big corporations, as opposed to working to the interests of the citizens and the livelihoods of the Africans. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much to all of you to have shared with us your experience. And next question I would like to pose you is more connected to our dialogue, and is what are the issues connected to prices that you try to tackle? And do producers in your countries or in the countries you work in suffer from low prices or any unfair practices concerning purchase from companies? And if you can also give us some example. I will start with Marike again.
Thank you. Well, producers in our countries, in Latin America and the Caribbean, as well as Africa, definitely we suffer quite a lot unfair trading practices. We are many times forced to sell our products below the cost of sustainable production. If you see coffee is sold at half of its production cost many times because prices are set. These are commodity prices, and farmers, at least in Latin America and the Caribbean, we are not price setters, we are price takers. So we need to take what is offered, and we are not able to set the price. I also think that these issues are not so difficult to solve. But if we see the debates around the last 3 decades, people try to find sophisticated solutions for quite an easy problem that should be tackled with fair pricing. But running around pricing, even in policies, in trade agreements, and not tackle it in the right way, we always will have the wrong solutions. So what prices do we need? We need prices that cover the cost of sustainable production, that enable us to produce in a climate-friendly way, but also that enable us to earn a decent living income for farmers as well for workers. It's a quite easy concept, but in practice, it seems quite difficult to get. Even in some policies, and we have seen quite some positive change recently as unfair Trading Practices Directive. If you see the hot topics on that list, prices is not amongst them. And I think it's one of the main problems we have when we produce a product that is not sold at the price it costs to produce it. No, so if we don't receive that price, and banana farmers aren't receiving it, and coffee farmers aren't receiving it, and cocoa farmers in Africa aren't receiving it, they still live below the poverty line. So we still have quite some issues to fix through pricing. If we don't get this price, we see negative impact, because fair pricing and decent income is a human right, but it's also a condition to fulfill other human rights. So what do we see? We see children working, we see forced labor, we see a lack of freedom of association, we see poor working conditions, as well as poor health and safety conditions. But also at the environmental side, we see that farmers use pesticides that are not good for the climate, not good for the soil. We see decreasing biodiversity, we see deforestation, land degradation, and there is no money left to invest in climate change. So definitely not paying a fair price comes at a high cost.
Thanks so much, Marike. It was very interesting, your viewpoint and what you explained to us. Muhammad?
Yes, thank you. I would like to give an example from government sector. So I want to share research findings. Our research findings recently completed a survey on suppliers in Bangladesh, garment suppliers, mainly supplying garments product to global north fashion retailers. So a survey of 1,000 suppliers carried out in December 2021. So our sample represents around 25% of all suppliers in Bangladesh supplying garments to global north. So this is one of the largest surveys our research team has ever conducted. And it was in collaboration with Transform Trade, and formerly the Tradecraft Exchange. So mainly we try to explore the impacts of fashion brands' unfair practices on suppliers based in global south. So our survey reveals that 50% of factories had been subject to at least one of the 4 unfair practices we investigated, including cancellation of orders, price reduction, refusal to pay goods, either in dispatched or in production, and delaying payment of invoices. So we found the major retailer, all top fashion brands based in USA, United Kingdom, and European countries, having highest proportion of unfair practices. So in December 2021, we found that 76% factories were selling brands to the brands at the same price as in March 2020. So the lockdown time in Bangladesh, in March 2020, almost 25% workers lost their jobs during that time. But the cost of raw materials, despite increase of cost of raw materials, the price of the garments did not change. We found that nearly 1 in 5 factories reported that they had been struggling to pay Bangladeshi minimum legal wages for garment workers. Interestingly, we found not a single supplier reported that they have taken their brands customers, buyers to court or sought legal actions for cancellation of orders or refusal to pay for goods. So this is our key findings. So this indicates that the unfair practices is widespread when the fashion retailers sourcing products from Bangladesh. So it has devastating impacts on workers as Marike also explained about agriculture sectors, child labor, forced labor. So the forced labor is a problematic aspects in Bangladeshi garment sectors. It is widespread, and we found that this kind of unfair practices actually led to human rights abuses, including forced labor and gender imbalance, gender violence. So it was actually also we found in our just previous research. Thank you.
Thank you so much. It's really interesting how you talked about different sectors, food sector and garment, but something that is under both sectors is the fact that some practices, some unfair practices are very similar. I will now ask Brenda to comment on the question. Thank you.
Thank you. I want to speak about it in 2 dimensions. When you ask about the connectedness to prices, I think it manifests itself in 2 ways, especially here in Africa. One is the aspect of whether there is actually a fair share from, say, the corporations that come into the country in terms of labor. Are they giving the communities a fair share from these particular projects? Which I would say that we're actually not seeing. And 2 is linked with the EU trade agreement specifically. And maybe I could start with that one. Most of the agreements that we have and certain deals that we have signed with the EU, and I can give an example of the dairy sector. We know that there is the dairy quota, where we've seen that the EU specifically has used that dairy quota to bring in their surplus milk. Well, there's an argument around the subsidies that are offered to the dairy sector. But what we see is that dairy products from the EU are being dumped in Africa. And now the implication is we see that the products are coming in from the EU because Africa is being used as a dumping center. We see these products coming in at a very cheap cost. And this has definitely affected our local production because you find that it is much easier to access products of Nestle at a cheap price as opposed to those that are locally produced here. And why this actually happens in that way is because as Uganda specifically, and I think that as the entire Africa, we still suffer a challenge of the high cost of being production. So you find the electricity tariffs are high, the infrastructure, it's expensive in the sense of it. So definitely the product that comes out is at a high cost because it has to bear those particular costs. But because we are bringing in these products that are benefiting from the EU trade agreements that we have, we end up seeing that everyone, the consumers definitely opt to go for those that we are importing as opposed to locally produced. And this has definitely affected our market. The other thing is that for most of our sectors, in fact, for all of our sectors in Uganda, we don't have like price caps. So there's that volatility when it comes to the prices. And this has affected all the sectors, especially the agriculture sectors, that where I come from, in my community, a liter of milk is sold at about 1,000 in our currency, which is something like 0.05 USDs. It is way less than $1. And when you get into the markets, the supermarkets, you find that a liter of milk is perhaps being sold at $1 US. So there is that difference that you see the person who doesn't get a fair share is actually the producer at the farm. They're not getting a fair share of that particular milk that they are selling, because the price is determined by the middleman. It is the one who is buying that is determining the price. And that is really very challenging. Countries like Tanzania and Kenya have come up with price caps where they determine the prices of certain products, but this is something we're not seeing in Uganda. And so we are still being directly affected by the existence of some of these agreements that we have. On the other hand, and this is also linked to the trade agreements that we have, we've seen certain incentives being created as a result of the agreements that we signed. For instance, we see a lot of tax holidays being awarded to investors that come into the country. And what would ideally expect is that with these particular corporations or investors benefiting from some of these agreements, would expect that these particular activities or projects can add or contribute to the growth of the community. Now, I'll give you an example of an area where we've been working closely, and it is around palm oil production. In Uganda, they gave out about 9 square miles of land to a particular investor to set up a palm oil plantation. This, again, is a person that has enjoyed a tax holiday of about 20 years. And while this corporation came into place, a lot of communities had to be evacuated from their land. So they were evicted because of the hope that this plantation could contribute to the country. And the idea was that when we are producing our palm oil, then it will definitely help us, for instance, to deal with prices for products like soap. But what we see, one, is that to date, we see that 60% of the oil that is produced by that particular palm oil plantation is being exported. So it is taken out of the country, and that definitely means we are not benefiting and we are losing out. But two, we are not getting a fair share in terms of revenue that is collected, because these are people that enjoy tax holidays. And lastly, which is really most important, is that even within the community, we are seeing that it is more detrimental to that particular community. And we've done a lot of studies around that community. And what communities share with us is that even the workers within the plantation, they don't have fair contractual obligations. They are tasked to forced labor. They are paid as less than $1 for a month, and really less than $1, and you're working for a whole month, and you're given 2,000 shillings in our currency, which is less than $1. That is definitely nothing. So in the long run, we see that these projects or these investments are benefiting just a few, but the biggest part of the community is not getting a fair share. And lastly, and this is happening especially around the coffee sector, where we're also doing a lot of work. We've engaged with farmers who have told us that they cannot afford a cup of coffee. Yet these are the ones that are actually growing the coffee. And when you do the math, you realize that a kilogram of coffee is sold at still less than $1. But even if you equate it to maybe $1, but usually it is less than that. And a small cup of coffee, coffee for consumption, is sold at about, I think, $5. So you can tell the difference, that a farmer has to sell 5 kilograms of coffee to be able to afford 1 cup of coffee. That definitely makes it challenging for that particular farmer. So they end up not taking on that particular price. And then the issue around competition, that, for instance, if it's to talk about coffee, we know that Nescafe has definitely dominated the coffee sector. so that even when you walk into everywhere, every part of the country, you will definitely be served with Nescafe. And because we don't have a competition policy, we cannot even have a discussion around fair competition between our local producers and then the local and then big corporations like Nescafe. I think this could clearly come out maybe as we move forward. But when you look at some of the EU agreements that we have, something like everything but arms, this is an agreement that opened up the EU markets for African products. However, this also came with with a condition that everything can be brought onto the EU market, but it has to be raw. And as you know, that the value chain, the higher the value chain, the higher the cost. But because we have an open market that only accepts products that are raw, we definitely cannot get a fair share in terms of the prices. Maybe I will elaborate more on that in the subsequent questions. I think I will stop here for now.
Thank you, Brenda. It was a really insightful example. And starting from your previous question, I will ask you, in your view, what particularly needs to be addressed and how? For example, what are the biggest obstacles you see or directly face in tackling these issues about prices? I will give the floor to Marike.
Well, I think there are many issues. One is around pricing. Another is about the lack of long-term trading relationship, which is definitely an obstacle, because if you have no stability in trade, it's very difficult to plan your production and even more difficult to plan progress in your lives, no? So on the one side, it's the pricing issue. On the other side, it's also the long-term relationship, and it's the value distribution. I think Brenda mentioned it, and the power distribution in trade. There are many producers on the one side, I think also many consumers on the other side. But in between, there are just a few actors that really control trade. And this power concentration based on maximum benefit is not healthy. It's not healthy for people. It's not healthy for the climate. So there is an issue about value distribution. There is an issue around power, which end up being an issue about on prices and also on the terms of trade. No, having said that, I think we need to work a little bit more around these prices, because the concept, you see it everywhere. You see it in policies, you see it in regulation. Everybody talks about fair prices, but we need to be more public and clear on what fair prices need to cover. And I think the expectation where we started with about of the European Union, they're very nice, but all these expectations is not the current reality. And if we want to have this perfect way of trading healthy food, healthy for people, healthy for the climate, we need to learn a little bit more about what does this cost? What do we need to do? And in this, there are also many initiatives about true cost, true price, or the true value of food. I think this is very helpful. We need to get a more alignment in methodology, but also these prices need to be public. And when these prices are public, there need to be a mechanism in place. Then when companies are not paying these prices, there need to be a consequence on it. So I think that is very important. Get it more public. What do you need to pay for 1 kilo of coffee? Definitely not $1, but what is this price coffee producers need to get or banana producers need to get? And then I think the other topic is if at the stage we are currently, after years of not having or not receiving these fair prices, is the payment of fair prices enough? I would say no, because on the ground you see producers that already suffering the negative impact of not having received these prices. So we see poor farming families, poor workers, poor communities. So there is quite some investment needed to get a positive circle, not a negative, people getting poorer. No, we need to improve people's livelihoods. So more investment is needed. And then I think we need to understand better what are these investments, how we get these, trigger these people out of poverty, what need to be done beyond paying fair prices. So there's a better understanding needed that all the things we don't want child labor, we don't want forced labor, we want healthy food. We need to understand why don't we have it and what need to be done. So there is a dialogue needed with farmers, with workers, with local authorities before setting this high bar on what we want. Because I think this is like saying, well, we want it, please fix it. That's not that easy, no? What are the obstacles? I think the European Union consumers are getting more clear about what they want. I think they have no idea how to get there. Even if you see the binding regulations and the strategies that have been developed, it's more about what do we want to see and not so much about how do we want to achieve it. The regulations are still going very slow. What I've seen up to date is quite weak. It's not really covering sufficient what we need. Many companies are not bounded by it. What we also see is all these high expectations are delegated to standard setters. Producers, farmers and workers organizations in our countries, we need to comply with more and more standards because we want this perfect food or this good produced garment. We want it. Probably we are not willing to pay for it, but we want it. So I think this delegation to certification make it even more difficult to farmers to meet all these requirements if it's not if it's not supported by better pricing or any other support farmers would need to meet this requirement, no? And finally, I think because we have lawyers in the room, if this is what we want, and if we get binding regulations to get there, so companies need to pay fair prices, they cannot stop a commercial relationship, they need to stay with the relationship, build these fair conditions together. Even then, how can farmers and workers claim their rights? And I think this is very important. It's about justice. I think that is very important. But we also need to enable pathways so farmers and workers can speak up, can say that our rights is not respected. And in some way, there need to be mechanism in place so farmers and workers can claim these rights. So a lot of obstacles, even more because we all are running into a crisis. Definitely, I would say, let's start to change our reality, but don't expect we can fix it from one day to another.
Thank you, Marike. It was really interesting to me that you said that along with prices, there are also rights to be respected and also practices to be seriously implemented. I will now give the floor to Muhammad to answer the question.
Yeah, thank you for very interesting discussion. I think I find the biggest challenge in garment sector is forced labor. Okay, so we have been observing for a long period of time, even before Rana Plaza collapse, the forced labor is always in the garment sector. If you look at Rana Plaza collapse that killed more than 1,100 workers, so if you look at that incident, that in the morning workers were hesitant to enter into the building because they saw the cracks in the building, and despite the cracks on the building, workers are forced by employers to go into the factories, and then consequently the buildings collapse, and then workers were killed. Those workers could be saved if owners did not force them to enter into the building. So this is a kind of psychological thing. I mean, the notion of forced labor you can find. And right after Rana Plaza, you see that Accord and Alliance came together to fix a structural problem, health and safety issue mainly. So safety of the building and safety of workers. So there were some improvement, what actually Accord and Alliance did. But unfortunately, they did not address the issue of forced labor. You see that the way fashion retailers have been bringing a different kind of mechanism, like a compliance audit. Sometimes they use third-party audit to make sure that their codes of conduct and complied codes of conduct are followed, closely followed, particularly forced labor, child labor, and gender violence. But the audit practices so far have failed to actually eliminate modern slavery and including forced labor in the factories. Partly because the way audit has been conducted, most of the audits are not surprise audit. Okay, so it is not regular audit, just before contract has been placed, maybe fashion retailers used auditor, even up during production. So they use auditors. Auditors enter into the building, talk to workers. So one of the key elements of actual audit is interview workers to understand their concern. That's the only way auditors can understand the forced labor and other problems, no other mechanism. And when the workers talk to auditor, workers are not empowered enough to talk to auditor. They're scared. They're managed. Like what Marike said, in agriculture sector, probably the producers are not empowered enough to negotiate price and to find the rights. Similarly, workers in garment sectors, so they are not empowered enough to say or raise their voices within the factory. Even the freedom of association is very weak. So the audit, the mechanism, one of the key instruments they have been using, the retailers have been using, are not working. And this is suggested by UK Modern Slavery Act. If you look at Australian Modern Slavery Act, and also the European Union Due Diligence Act, they all have been suggesting a key part of due diligence even is audit, monitoring the practices. I find this is problematic because the retailers, the way retailers have been using audit to control suppliers, to understand. So it's just a mechanism to just to legitimize their operation rather than to create change on the ground. The entire circumstances is designed is framed such a way that suppliers are bad people, culprits, and they needs to be audited. But on the other hand, you see that the framework is designed such a way that the retailers are moral, they're moral and they're good people, and they only bad people are supplied. Those who are responsible for forced labor and gender violence and so on. But the problem actually, there is no mechanism to discipline retailers. There's no mechanism to hold retailers accountable for their unfair practices, which is partly responsible for forced labor condition. So this is one of the issue I have been doing research on, and along with this issue, I would say the transparency is the key issue. So the way social audit is being injected in the name of transparency actually is not creating any transparency. I would imagine, that those who are claiming, in the supermarket or others, they're claiming, their products are free from forced labor. I would say they are not 100% sure that their products are free from forced labor. This is partly because the traceability issue, the transparency issue, how products are produced, we are never sure. We are never sure where those products are produced, even though retailers disclose their factory locations. So the traceability is one of the fundamental problem, and they are using audit to determine that the transparency has been ensured. It is a problematic part in the global trade. Thank you.
Thank you so much also to have put an emphasis on the issue of transparency. And I will now give the floor to Brenda.
Thank you. Well, I believe that what needs to be addressed for me, for this particular discussion, two things. One, I believe that why we see all the challenges that we've talked about is because we are not negotiating enough. So I think that it would really be imperative that we think about negotiating better markets. And this is purely trade, because when we negotiate, when Africa negotiates with the EU, and we have a deal like everything but arms, we have AGOA with the US, where we saw with AGOA, East Africa specifically decided to boost its textile industry, but it was summoned that it would be cut off from benefiting from AGOA if they had to do that. So that definitely comes back to affect our production, and in the long run affects the markets and also the prices. So I believe that there is need for Africa to have a say on the negotiating table. Today, negotiations are ongoing for an intra-Africa free trade agreement. I believe that these are some of the alternatives that we can explore to be able to address some of these long-standing challenges. The second one is, and I think this is the most important, is there's need for us to review our policies, especially our investment policies. Now, I'll give you specific examples as to why. My colleagues have talked about livelihoods. They've talked about issues of forced labor. They've talked about all these particular issues that continue to manifest themselves. And what you see, especially, I could give Uganda as a case study. Uganda, we have a national investment law, which was just amended in 2019. But when you read it from the start to the end, it in no way speaks about protecting the rights of the workers, the rights of the environment, the rights of the communities where these projects are being set up, maybe issues of free, prior, and informed consent. All those are not addressed within our national investment law, which already creates a gap that even when we see investors coming in place and they don't care about the prices and the issues of labor, it's because there's no strong guiding legal framework. Number two is even beyond our national investment policies. the international and bilateral investment treaties that we continue to sign also suffer from a similar challenge. And provided we still have bilateral investment treaties, multilateral investment agreements that do not address the rights or do not prioritize the rights of the communities, the rights of the people, then we'll continue to see exploitation that is happening at the moment. So for me, I believe that if we can work into those two areas, then a lot would be changed, because at the moment, and we've actually taken some of these corporations to court, but even when you go to court, you realize you don't have a cause of action, because you're not saying they violated a particular piece of law, because your law is silent on this. So it already creates a loophole, and these loopholes are being exploited. And maybe just to bring in an aspect of environment. For instance, I know that you're so much interested in issues of climate justice. But even when we speak about climate justice, we still see our governments being involved in signing certain agreements that are of a danger to our environment, like the Energy Charter Treaty. And I know if you've interacted with the Energy Charter Treaty, you know how much and how many implications it has to the environment. So when we continue to negotiate bad agreements like those, then the effect is felt by the communities. And that is why we continue to see the forced labor and all these challenges that we've already mentioned. And maybe lastly, I think it also goes to the mindset. We have an investment authority in the country, and when you check through its website, and it talks about some of the reasons why someone should invest in Uganda, one of the reasons it highlights is that we have cheap labor. And this is a whole government entity that is talking about how we have cheap labor. It is already showing you the exploitative nature of our relationship, and definitely whoever comes into the country is going to exploit that particular aspect. And then at the end of the day, we continue to see these challenges manifesting.
Thank you so much, Brenda. And I will now ask a final question to the three of you, starting with Marike. The question is the following. The European Union is currently working on a set of regulation framework, such as the EU regulation on deforestation-free products, as you already mentioned, that will cover key sectors such as cocoa or coffee, but also the directive on corporate sustainability due diligence. While well-intended, these policies are criticized for being formulated in Europe and lacking other countries or the producer's perspective. We would like to hear what solutions would effectively address the needs of producers, and what rules shall be included in any new or law or bilateral trade agreements signed by the EU in order for various views to be taken into account and not just the one of the European Union. I will start again with Marike.
Thank you. Yes, there are quite some good initiatives. Starting with no more products with deforestation. In principle, I would say, okay, but not this way. Because the question is, should be, why do we still have products and deforestation? And what do we need to do to change that? What has been EU's contribution to having the problems, and what need to be the contribution to solving the problems? So I definitely think that saying we don't want it is not good enough. We don't want deforestation. We don't want human rights violation. It is too easy, because all these challenges on people and the environment they didn't start it yesterday and we won't solve it tomorrow. It's not something we need to treat as a taboo, because while we treat it as a taboo, child labor is a taboo, forced labor is a taboo. Yes, we never will solve it because we need to understand why we have it. The policymakers need to understand better why we have it. And so we can build better solutions for the problem, but we need to build it together. And I think this is what is lacking. Definitely, as on the farmers' side, we feel that many of these regulations are cooked in Europe with very good intentions, also with the intentions to make companies co-responsible in trying to solve all these issues. But there is still a very top-down approach. We have a problem. Definitely, it's also already better to say we are part of the problem. So that would be the corporate social responsibility. But there is very weak dialogue with the people that suffer the problem. So it can be very easy to say that the companies say, well, the problem is A, while the producer said, no, the problem is B. Or the companies say the solution is C, and the farmers say, no, the solution definitely is D. So if we don't create this understanding between suppliers and buyers through an inclusive dialogue, a respectful dialogue that build effective solutions, it won't happen. Also, while we still have all these issues in the taboo zone, because you cannot say we have child labor in coffee, deforestation in cocoa, you should not say it, because then people start buying from you. I don't think we are able to see the demands, how big this challenge is. So it's better to say, yes, we have it. There's reasons why we have it. We need to solve it together. What are we going to do about it? Having said that, I think we already consider businesses co-responsible, and we hope businesses will take up this co-responsibility, but also local governments are co-responsible. And they need to be part of the dialogue, because if we need to tackle all these issues, governments are part of the solution, and not only the European Union, or developed countries, but also governments of our countries need to create the laws, the policies, the regulations, the protection mechanism. So there's quite some work to do. And I think the only way we can get there is with an inclusive dialogue, because the people that suffer the problems have probably more realistic solutions for the problems, getting all these issues out of the taboo zone, making sure it's not an easy fix. It will take its time, but together we can do it.
Thank you. I will now give the floor to Muhammad.
Yeah, no, thank you, Francisco. As I mentioned, that the entire design of regulation, the way it's framed, and in European countries, in Australia or in the UK Modern Slavery Act 2015, Australian Modern Slavery Act 2018, I read all those acts and I did research on this. And I also read European regulation, the due diligence one, and German, due diligence act. It is not surprising to me, actually, the provisions in the regulations and the contents in the regulations, mainly considering that suppliers need to be controlled, supplier needs to be disciplined. Suppliers in Global South, particularly, they need to be disciplined. They're bad people, and as if retailers are good people, so they will use this due diligence technique, a model, and then they will apply on suppliers. But they do not think that that retailers could be bad. Retailers could be unethical, unfair. So the unfair provisions is not unfair practices. I do not see in due diligence bill. I don't see actually, these provisions is included. How to control unfair practices, how to eliminate unfair practices. Another issue is risk management. You will see in the law, they often ask, how to manage risk. One of the key steps of due diligence is to assess risk and how to minimize risk. Minimize risk means here they use risk the way they use the term risk for investors, risk for themselves, rather than risk of being victims of slavery. So it is not about, reducing or eliminating modern slavery. So they are prone to, the people, workers in Global South are prone to modern slavery or forced labor. This risk management tool has been prescribed in the law, is not addressing, the elimination of slavery or elimination of forced labor. So this is actually, if you think of risk management from investors' perspective, then actually, you're thinking about thinking of your profit. Maybe you might think, okay, so there's a risk because if there is if child labor is found by media and others, there will have adverse impact on their sales and so on. So I see this kind of issues, particularly I do not see any real attempt in the law that how to eliminate, how to save the workers, in the Global South. So I do not see any specific provision. I looked at German's act, which is, I found that one step ahead of other modern slavery act in the UK and Australia. So the penalty provision, fines. So in UK Modern Slavery Act 2015, there is no fine for non-compliant. Even Australian Act similarly, but the German Act, they are one step ahead. So the retailers can be fined up to 8 million euro or 2% of sales turnover, whichever is higher. So which is actually quite interesting provisions. So it's quite radical, I would say. And one of the actually concern we have so far in the UK is that that supplier, the retailers needs to be penalized somehow if there is some non-compliant or child labor is found or forced labor found in their supply factories. So so this is the one of the mechanism. But the problem with this, that the challenge with finding retailers, those who it is if you the mechanism to penalize retailers is unclear in the law, and it is not clear also how the regulatory body investigates supply factories. I mean, there's this another regime, so it could be in Myanmar, it could be in Bangladesh, it could be in China. So to investigate and to find out non-compliant factories could be a challenging. Yeah, so that's it. I think it's somehow disconnected. Hello. Hi, can you hear me?
It's working. We can hear you.
Yeah. All right. Thank you. Yeah. That's actually, so my concern about the law can say, that someone can be penalized, but it is in different regime, so going to Global South and investigate something really happen in the factories. So it is probably a bilateral thing. Bilateral agreement needs to be done between two countries. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Muhammad. And I will now give the floor to Brenda.
Okay, so I think that almost everything has been said, and so I'll just use really very few minutes. This is what I think, and based on all the discussion that we've had, oftentimes we've seen the EU coming up with certain policies and regulations that in a way affect Africa mostly. Recently, we saw the carbon border adjustment mechanism in the effort towards addressing issues of energy transition. But we already see that this is definitely going to affect the products that come from Africa, because the likelihood is some of them are not environmental friendly goods. So I believe that like my first colleague said, I believe that the aspect of inclusiveness is something that really needs to be addressed. And inclusiveness to include young people, to include civil society, to include the media, because it's important that there's that space for the civil society actors to have a say in the regulations that are put on table. Two, I believe that to address most of the challenges that we've mentioned today, one of the key aspects, I don't know if it's already addressing it, but if not, I think the aspect of extraterritorial obligations is something that we really need to clearly see coming out in the EU. And why that is specific is today we see that all these violations that are happening at the continent or in the continent, they go unregulated. However, if we had maybe the extraterritorial obligation rules working, then we'd be able to see if it's a German corporation, would be able to see German taking it on, or maybe Britain or whichever country taking it on. So I believe that issues of extraterritorial obligation need to be given a seat in those regulations that are being worked on. And lastly, and specifically for the producers, I believe that if Africa is to stop being trapped at the lower bottom of the value chain, we need to come up with clear guidelines on prices. Because if there is no response to the current challenges that we talked about in the beginning, how we see the middlemen being the ones to set the prices, then definitely the producers will continue to be affected. We need to see, we see the International Coffee Organization, for instance, for coffee. We see certain organizations that have tried to address some of these challenges, and they've also failed. And this has not really worked. We know that sometimes the EU plays a key role in terms of pushing some of these policies. I believe that for us to help our producers, we need to put price caps. And this could come to the national level, but these are guidelines that we believe we should have at the multilateral levels, because that way we can, even as civil society, we can find a better way to convince our governments to incorporate some of those aspects within our national policies. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Brenda. Now I will give the floor to Victoria, who is going to address some questions from the audience. But first, I would like to thank personally you, the speakers, for having been with us today. And I would like to say that I'm very grateful for having had the opportunity to moderate this very insightful dialogue with you. Now, Victoria, the floor is yours.
So we have some questions from audience, and one of the listeners wants to ask, are there any examples of international trade agreements that regulate the prices at the global level currently at place that work and that have improved the lives of workers and farmers? And I should give floor to whoever feel like answering the question.
Maybe I could come in. There's none that I know of. And the only prices or regulation that we've seen trying to regulate prices are usually set by the governments themselves. So I don't know of an international trade agreement that speaks about regulating the prices, but I think this is, for countries where we've seen it, it is done by the government itself, like Tanzania, like Kenya is also doing.
Thank you so much for the answer. And we have another question, which says, given the current state of affairs, the large corporations in the global north capture the majority of the value while neglecting to distribute it equitably throughout the entire value chain. And the listener is curious to know if the panelists believe that viable solutions can be identified and implemented, or if a fundamental system change is necessary. For instance, if countries such as Ghana and Ivory Coast are primary suppliers for the cocoa to Europe, should they not be primary beneficiaries? Can they sell the final product directly to supermarkets and get rid of most intermediaries?
Let me come in first, and maybe my colleagues can also add to this, especially the examples that have been highlighted of Ghana and Ivory Coast. I think I talked about this in the beginning, that what affects our prices or the benefits that we can get from our products is how much we go in terms of value addition. And for very many years today, we see that our relationship with the global north, especially with the EU, is extractive in nature. That when you read every trade agreement that the EU has signed with Africa, the Cotonou Agreement, the post-Cotonou Agreement, the economic partnerships agreements, they only advance the exploitative relationship, where it is extractive in nature, that they look at, are you exporting in a raw form? And that is why you see that up to date, like I gave you an example of say coffee. It is very difficult for even our producers here to add value, because the target market is definitely the EU. So once they've added a value to their products to make the final product, the question that comes to the mind is, who is going to consume this particular coffee? Definitely, we know that our consumption levels are low, and our biggest market, and as it stands today, our biggest trading partner is the EU. So if the EU has already negotiated an agreement like everything but arms, where they expect you to bring in everything raw, then it means that when you add value, you lose market. So countries will rather opt for selling in a raw form so that they can still have a market. But this is also a mindset that needs to be changed. And that is why I talked about Africa coming up with Afrocentric narratives and strategies for themselves. If it's the AfCFTA that we are addressing today, Africa needs to see how best we can trade amongst each other, because as it stands now, Africa, we are not, Ghana is not trading with Uganda. Our intra-Africa trade is very low. And so we rely on the global markets, and especially the EU. And with those conditions put in place, we definitely have to remain trapped at the lower bottom. That is why cocoa, which is a 100 billion industry, Ghana is still getting as low as, I think, 2% from the cocoa. So that is a challenge, and it's not going to be solved until we change the agreements that we have with the EU. When we change some of those policies, then it is when we can be able to see. And also, if we can be able to create, I think for me, that's an alternative. If we can be able to create our internal market, that we know that we are not relying on the EU market. If say Africa, if Ghana is adding value to the cocoa and it's producing chocolate, if there is assurance of an African market for that, which I think still has a long way to go, because our consumption patterns are also not that good, that even when we are to consume, I gave you an example that everyone would rather opt for Nescafe as opposed to our own locally produced coffee. So we still have a lot to change, but in the moment, that is why we are still seeing that Ghana or Ivory Coast or whichever country cannot do anything much as in terms of adding value to those products.
Thank you so much for the answer, and I'll give the floor to Julia.
Yes, well, in the name of the economic sustainability team, I would like to thank you all for joining the dialogue. We will have to close it now because of the limited time. Starting with me, I would stay here for 2 more hours, but this is the time that we have today. I love how specific it went. This is very unusual. So this is going to be extremely helpful to write that demands paper that is going to be discussed with members of the European Parliament. We have talked about several topics. We have heard about unfair working conditions and human rights violations provoked by profit-driven corporations, the importance of understanding the true cost and transparency of prices, that human rights due diligence regulations must include procedures to enforce accountability from businesses, and that the problem is that there is also no mechanism to hold retailers accountable. To finish, I would just like to highlight something that you, Muhammad, said. The problem is that regulations are written in terms of risk for investors and not in terms of eliminating forced labor. So thank you so much, everyone, for joining. Next session, as I said before, is going to be on the 7th of March at 3 p.m. The link is already on the chat that Matthias shared. It is going to focus on gender, the unheard voices, so you cannot miss it. Thank you again, and wish you a lovely evening, morning, wherever you are.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. Thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you. Thank you all.
Thank you and bye.